For more than a century, the world looked at Africa as a continent to be acted upon rather than reckoned with. The borders drawn in distant European capitals during the late 19th century, when delegates gathered in Berlin in 1884 and 1885 to carve up a continent they barely understood, left scars that still shape African politics today. Lines were drawn through ancient kingdoms, across grazing lands, and over the homes of peoples who shared neither language nor history with the neighbors suddenly forced to share a flag. The colonial powers extracted rubber from the Congo, gold from the Witwatersrand, cocoa from the Gold Coast, and diamond from the deserts of the Southwest, and they did so with a brutality that historians are still uncovering. King Leopold's private fiefdom in the Congo alone is believed to have cost millions of lives. When the wave of independence swept the continent in the late 1950s and 1960s, from Ghana in 1957 to the dozens of nations that followed, the new leaders inherited states whose very shapes had been designed for extraction rather than nationhood. For decades afterward, during the long contest between Washington and Moscow, Africa became a chessboard once again. The Cold War turned countries like Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia, and Somalia into proxy theaters where superpowers armed rival factions and propped up convenient dictators. Civil wars raged, economies stagnated, and the promise of independence curdled into disillusionment for millions. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the West largely lost interest. Africa was spoken of in conferences as a problem to be managed, a recipient of aid, a place of famine and conflict rather than opportunity. Structural adjustment programs imposed by international lenders demanded austerity and privatization, and in many places living standards fell rather than rose. The continent seemed, to outside eyes, to be drifting at the margins of history. But beneath that surface of neglect, the foundations of a dramatic reversal were quietly forming. Africa held something the 21st century would crave with desperate intensity. Beneath its soil lay an extraordinary share of the planet's mineral wealth, roughly a third of the world's known reserves, including the cobalt and copper of the Democratic Republic of Congo, the platinum and chromium of southern Africa, the bauxite of Guinea, the uranium of Niger, and vast reserves of oil and gas stretching from Nigeria to Angola to the newly discovered fields off Mozambique and Senegal. As the world began its uneven march toward electric vehicles, renewable energy, and digital technology, these were no longer peripheral commodities. They were the very building blocks of the future economy, and Africa sat upon a disproportionate share of them. Equally important was the continent's human story. While populations aged and shrank across Europe and East Asia, Africa was growing younger and larger at a pace without precedent. By the early 21st century, it was clear that within a few decades, 1 in 4 human beings on Earth would be African, and the continent's cities were swelling into some of the largest urban centers in the world. Lagos, Kinshasa, Cairo, and Nairobi were becoming engines of consumption, labor, and ambition. A continent once dismissed as a charity case was emerging as the last great frontier of growth, the place where the future workforce of the planet would be born and where the markets of tomorrow would expand. It was this combination of mineral abundance, energy reserves, and human dynamism that began to draw the eyes of the world's great powers back to Africa with a hunger reminiscent of an earlier age. But this time the competition would not be fought primarily with gunboats and colonial governors. It would be waged with loans and infrastructure, with diplomacy and arms deals, with telecommunications networks and military bases, and with the soft persuasion of investment and partnership. The new scramble had begun, quieter than the old one, but no less consequential, and African governments, now sovereign actors rather than colonial subjects, found themselves courted from every direction. The question that would define the century was no longer whether the world wanted Africa, but on whose terms that desire would be satisfied, and whether Africans themselves would finally be the authors of their own destiny rather than the objects of someone else's design. At the turn of the millennium, while Western capitals still regarded Africa largely as a domain for humanitarian aid and the occasional security crisis, a different kind of power was preparing to engage the continent with patience, capital, and ambition. China, having transformed itself within a single generation from an impoverished agrarian society into the workshop of the world, needed two things to sustain its astonishing rise: raw materials to feed its factories and markets to absorb its goods. Africa offered both in abundance. In the year 2000, Beijing convened the first Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, a gathering that few in the West paid much attention to at the time, but which marked the opening move of one of the most consequential geopolitical strategies of the century. Where Western lenders attached conditions about governance, human rights, and economic reform, China arrived with a different proposition. It offered to build, and to build quickly. Across the continent, Chinese firms erected highways, railways, ports, dams, stadiums, airports, and government buildings at a pace and scale that left observers astonished. The railway connecting Nairobi to the Kenyan coast, the rebuilt rail line linking landlocked Ethiopia to the sea at Djibouti, the highways threading through Angola, and the hydroelectric dams rising across the continent all bore Chinese financing and Chinese engineering. By the second decade of the century, China had become Africa's largest trading partner by far, and its presence was visible in nearly every capital city. The Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing's sprawling global infrastructure vision, found some of its most enthusiastic expression on African soil. The Western powers, slow to grasp the scale of what was happening, gradually awakened to the realization that their long-assumed influence was being eclipsed. The United States, the former colonial powers of Europe, and newer players alike began to recalibrate. Washington launched initiatives intended to counter Chinese infrastructure lending, promising private investment and transparent partnerships. European nations, bound to Africa by history, geography, and migration, sought to renew ties that had frayed. Summits multiplied. Aid packages were announced. Development corporations were created and recapitalized. Yet the West often struggled to match the speed and the no-strings-attached appeal of Chinese financing, and many African leaders, weary of lectures about governance, found Beijing's pragmatism refreshing even when its terms were hard. The rivalry was not merely economic. It extended into the strategic and military realm in ways that made the contest unmistakably geopolitical. In the small but strategically vital nation of Djibouti, situated at the mouth of the Red Sea, where one of the world's busiest shipping lanes passes, the competition became almost theatrical. There, within a few miles of one another, the United States operated its largest permanent military base on the continent, while China established its first overseas naval base, and the forces of France, Japan, and others maintained installations of their own. The control of sea lanes, the security of energy shipments, and the projection of power across the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea turned this tiny country into a microcosm of global rivalry. Beneath the surface of roads and ports lay a deeper contest over the architecture of the future. Chinese telecommunications firms wired the continent with fiber optic cables and built the data networks on which African economies increasingly depended, raising questions in Western capitals about surveillance, security, and the long-term dependencies being created. Whoever built the digital backbone of Africa, many strategists understood, would shape not only its commerce but its information, its politics, and perhaps its very alignment in the contest to come. The West offered alternatives and warnings. China offered finished networks and convenient financing. For African governments, this rivalry presented both peril and opportunity. The wiser leaders learned to play the suitors against one another, extracting better terms, more investment, and greater respect than any single patron would have offered alone. Yet the dangers were real. Debts accumulated, sometimes to unsustainable levels, and the specter of strategic assets being surrendered when loans could not be repaid haunted public debate. The contest between dragons and eagles, between an ascendant China and an anxious West, was reshaping the continent in real time, and its outcome would help determine not only Africa's future, but the balance of power across the entire world. To understand why the great powers compete so fiercely for influence in Africa, one must descend beneath the politics and into the earth itself, into the mines and oil fields and the supply chains that connect them to the factories and consumers of the wider world. The modern economy, with its insatiable appetite for batteries, semiconductors, renewable energy, and digital infrastructure, runs on a narrow set of critical materials, and Africa controls a remarkable share of them. Nowhere is this clearer than in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a vast and troubled nation that holds the majority of the world's accessible cobalt, a metal essential to the lithium-ion batteries that power electric vehicles and the devices in nearly every pocket on the planet. The Cobalt of Congo tells a story that captures both the promise and the tragedy of Africa's resource wealth. In the mineral-rich provinces of the southeast, industrial mines operated by international companies sit alongside artisanal diggings where men, women, and sometimes children scrape or from the ground by hand, often in dangerous conditions and for meager pay. The metal they extract travels through long and often opaque supply chains, much of it processed in China before being woven into the products of the global economy. The wealth generated is immense, yet the communities that sit atop these riches frequently remain among the poorest on earth, a paradox that has shadowed African resource extraction since the colonial era and that critics call the resource curse. This curse, the strange phenomenon by which mineral abundance correlates with conflict, corruption, and stagnation rather than prosperity, has played out repeatedly across the continent. Oil wealth in the Niger Delta brought pollution, militancy, and grievance alongside great fortunes. Diamonds funded brutal civil wars in Sierra Leone and Angola, earning the grim name of blood diamonds. The challenge for African nations in the new era of geopolitical competition is to break this cycle, to convert the world's hunger for their resources into lasting development, rather than another chapter of extraction that enriches outsiders and local elites while leaving ordinary people behind. The instrument through which much of this competition flows is infrastructure, and infrastructure, in turn, is built on debt. The roads, railways, and ports that knit together African economies and carry their resources to the sea are extraordinarily expensive, and the financing for them increasingly came from foreign lenders, with China prominent among them. For governments long starved of investment, the offer of a new railway or a modern port financed by a willing partner was difficult to refuse. Yet these loans accumulated, and as global interest rates rose and commodity prices fluctuated, several nations found themselves struggling under burdens they could not easily bear. The phrase debt trap diplomacy entered the global vocabulary, describing the fear that lenders might one day seize strategic assets when borrowers defaulted. The reality of African debt proved more complicated than any single slogan. Much of the continent's debt was owed not to any single foreign government, but to a tangle of private bondholders, multilateral institutions, and various creditors, and the causes of distress often had as much to do with global economic shocks, pandemics, and currency pressures as with any deliberate trap. Several countries did fall into painful debt crises, forced into restructurings and austerity that squeezed their populations. The lesson many African policymakers drew was not that investment should be refused, but that it must be negotiated with eyes open, with transparency, and with a clear assessment of whether a given project would generate the returns needed to justify its cost. Amid these challenges, a more hopeful possibility began to take shape. African leaders increasingly spoke of moving up the value chain, of refining their own minerals rather than exporting raw, or of manufacturing batteries rather than merely supplying their ingredients, of capturing more of the wealth their resources generated. Ambitious efforts to build a continental free trade area aimed to create the largest single market in the world by number of countries, allowing African economies to trade with one another, build regional industries, and bargain with outside powers from a position of greater collective strength. The economics of influence, long a story of extraction and dependency, were beginning, however unevenly, to shift. Whether Africa could finally turn its astonishing endowment of resources into broad and lasting prosperity would depend not only on the choices of distant powers, but on the vision, unity, and resolve of Africans themselves. If the 20th century belonged in many ways to Europe and North America, and the early 21st century saw the dramatic rise of Asia, then the decades ahead may well be shaped in profound and surprising ways by Africa. The reason lies above all in the simplest and most powerful of forces: people. While the populations of the world's older economies grow gray and begin to shrink, with fewer babies born each year and ever larger shares of citizens entering old age, Africa stands apart as the great exception. Its population is young, growing, and vast, and the trajectory it is on will reshape the demographics of the entire planet within the lifetimes of children alive today. The numbers are difficult to grasp. By the middle of the century, demographers project that Africa will be home to well over 2 billion people, and that 1 in every 4 human beings on Earth will be African. By the century's end, that share could rise even higher, with the continent accounting for a great share of all the world's young people and workers. While factories in aging societies struggle to find labor, Africa will possess the largest pool of working-age people on the planet. This is the so-called demographic dividend, the potential surge of economic energy that comes when a society has many workers and relatively few dependents, the very phenomenon that helped power the spectacular rise of East Asia in earlier decades. Yet a dividend is only a potential, not a guarantee, and herein lies the central drama of Africa's future. For all those young people to become a source of prosperity rather than instability, they must be educated, employed, and given the chance to build productive lives. This demands schools and universities, hospitals and clinics, factories and farms, and above all, the creation of tens of millions of jobs each year. If those jobs materialize, Africa could become the engine of global growth, a continent of booming cities, expanding middle classes, and dynamic markets that the entire world will court. If they do not, the same youthful energy could curdle into frustration, unrest, and migration on a scale that would reverberate far beyond the continent's shores. This is precisely why the great powers compete so intensely for influence, for they understand that the Africa of the future will be too large, too young, and too important to ignore. The continent's votes in international forums, its markets for goods and services, its position astride critical sea lanes, its reserves of the minerals that will power the green transition, and its sheer human weight all make it indispensable to any nation that hopes to shape the coming world order. The contest is no longer about whether Africa matters, for that question has been definitively answered. It is about what kind of partner and on what terms Africa will choose to be. The technological dimension of this future adds another layer of possibility. Across the continent, the leapfrogging of older technologies has produced striking innovations. Mobile banking, pioneered in places like Kenya, brought financial services to millions who had never seen the inside of a bank. Renewable energy offers the chance to power growth without repeating the carbon-intensive path of earlier industrializers. A generation of African entrepreneurs, engineers, and creators is building companies, producing films and music that reach global audiences and asserting a cultural confidence that earlier generations could scarcely have imagined. The narrative of a continent defined only by crisis is giving way, however gradually, to one of energy, creativity, and ambition. The challenges, of course, remain formidable. Climate change strikes hardest at societies that did least to cause it, threatening farmers with drought and coastal cities with rising seas. Governance struggles, corruption, and conflict still afflict many states. The fruits of growth are too often captured by narrow elites. Yet the trajectory of history is rarely a straight line, and the same continent that was carved up by outsiders in one century may yet become a principal author of the next. The decisive question is whether Africans will harness their extraordinary endowment of youth, resources, and ingenuity to shape their own destiny, transforming a long history as the object of others' ambitions into a future as a maker of the world. The battlefield of geopolitics is real, but the prize is not merely Africa's resources. The prize, in the end, is the future itself, and the world has finally understood that a great share of that future will be written on African soil.